Welcome to Velvet Murmurs, where every whisper hides a secret. I'm so glad you've joined us for today's mystery. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from mystery lovers all around the world. Miss Marple and the Silent Twins. Chapter 1. Arrival at Greystoke Hall. The first hint that something was not quite as it should be at Greystoke Hall came in the form of a letter that looked like two people had written it. Miss Marple noticed it before she ever set foot in the house. She was travelling down from St. Mary Mead with a small valise and a sensible hat, the kind that did not blow off one's head in country winds, when she unfolded Lady Florence Greystoke's invitation again to make certain of the time. The invitation was kind, warm even, and yet somewhere in the middle line where Eleanor appeared, the hand changed ever so slightly. A firmer cross to the T, a loop that strayed outside the usual margin of Florence's tidy script. Most people would have thought nothing of it. Miss Marple, who had darned stockings and observed human nature for longer than most ailments last, thought it very odd indeed. The lane that led to Greystoke Hall ran between hedgerows blooming with cow parsley and buttercups. The house appeared as a pale stone rectangle with ivy at the corners and chimneys like sentries. It had the kind of grounds that suggested antique money, not ostentation but polish, gravel raked, lawns clipped close as a gentleman's hair, and a long border of delphiniums standing in disciplined ranks. Miss Marple's taxi crunched to a stop, and before the door opened, a small figure peered out of an upstairs window, then vanished like a bird in a hedge. Mrs. Jane Marple. The butler, one of those reliable English fixtures, discreet and dry, had a voice that sounded like polished brass. "Her ladyship is expecting you, Benson, if you please," he added to a young footman who hurried forward for the luggage. Miss Marple was shown through a hall where family portraits looked down with the uncritical satisfaction of those who had never worried about coal prices. The scent of beeswax and a faint sweet perfume drifted from the drawing-room. Lady Florence rose from a sofa as Miss Marple entered, elegant still, though age had thinned her, and her silk scarf was the colour of ripe apricot. "My dear Jane, I'm so glad you could come." She kissed Miss Marple's cheek, then held her at arm's length. "You never change." "That is very kind, Florence," Miss Marple said, "though I do, alas, find my roses less accommodating every year. Sit here by the light. You must tell me about your nephew's latest dreadful book. He is dreadfully clever." Lady Florence settled Miss Marple with tea, and as cups and saucers chimed, she added with a brightness that did not quite ring true, "You must meet the children's governess, such a find. Eleanor Grey, very steady, very calm. The children have been much improved." "Children are like peas," Miss Marple said mildly. "They do better under a kind steak than under a boot." She turned her head as footsteps sounded beyond the door. Two children, Christopher, 8, with a sprig of straw in his hair, and Annabel, 6, with an air of earnestness that sometimes hangs about small girls who watch rather than shout, were being gently shepherded along by a young woman in a dark blue dress. She had neat features, pale skin, and a watchfulness that suggested she took in not only what one said, but what one meant. "Miss Marple," Lady Florence said, "this is Miss Eleanor Grey. Children, say how do you do." "How do you do, Miss Marple?" the children chorused. Eleanor's smile was competent, unflurried. There was nothing particularly remarkable about her, except, perhaps, an economy in the way she moved, as if she used no more effort than required. Miss Marple found such economy often belonged to people who had had to manage for themselves. "Very pleased to make your acquaintance," Miss Marple said. "What a well-behaved pair you are, and what is that peeking from your pocket, Christopher? A frog, perhaps?" Christopher's eyes widened. "Only a piece of fern," he said, too quickly. Annabel reached across and plucked the offending green and placed it on a table with the solemnity of an offertory. Eleanor's mouth quirked and then flattened. "You see," Lady Florence said, "steadying influence. They were wilder than rabbits when she came." "Children are only vigorous," Eleanor said pleasantly. "They like to know where the hedges are. Once they can see them, they rarely attempt to get lost." It was a good answer. Miss Marple reached for a biscuit, and Eleanor, with a small movement of hand and eye, indicated the plate nearer. Polite, precise, attentive, all proper. But the faint perfume that clung to her, something like bitter orange, caught Miss Marple's notice. She could not say why then. She only tucked it away, as one tucks a safety pin into a cuff. Tea ended. The children were coaxed away to change their shoes, and Lady Florence, with a glance towards the door, lowered her voice. "You will find the house altered, Jane. Since my son and daughter-in-law went to India, one must make do with skeleton staff, and one hears everything that rattles. But Eleanor, Miss Grey, has been a support." "Good governesses," Miss Marple said, "are like good bread." One only notices the lack. They were discussing a village subscription for the church roof when the bell pealed from the front door, too energetic for a messenger, too late for a tradesman. Miss Marple saw Lady Florence's hand tighten on the arm of the sofa, just briefly. The butler's voice came, then another voice, female, bright and uncertain, and a flurry in the hall as if a cushion had been plumped unexpectedly. The drawing-room door opened, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Lane, a stout woman with moral opinions arranged like pins on a pincushion, bobbed in. "My lady, there is Miss Margaret Grey," she announced, and on Margaret, her expression was not so much disapproving as careful. "Miss Eleanor's sister." The young woman who entered might have been Eleanor's reflection if mirrors occasionally smiled more than their originals. The resemblance was startling. The same pale oval face, the same measured mouth, the same eyes, though these sparkled more. She wore a dove-grey travelling suit and held a hat with a pinned veil. A small trunk waited in the hall. "Lady Florence," she said, breathless with a hopefulness that felt practised. "I do beg your pardon for arriving unannounced. My ship only docked yesterday, and I could not bear another night at a hotel when my sister is under the same sky. I am Margaret. Eleanor, where is she?" "Eleanor is with the children," Lady Florence said, the warmth in her tone strictly courteous. "You are very welcome. Such a surprise." Miss Marple rose, offered her hand, and saw how Margaret's gaze flicked, quick as a swallow, about the room. To the tea things, the window, the inner door. Some travellers do that, she thought. Others, who are not merely travellers, do it more. Margaret's glove brushed Miss Marple's palm and left a trace of fragrance that was familiar from the drawing-room, but stronger now, almost enveloping. Bitter orange, yes, and a powdery sweetness beneath, something fashionable. "Eleanor dislikes perfume," Lady Florence said, in the tone of someone making conversation while producing information. "A great comfort to the children who get headaches." "Oh," Margaret said. "I am more foolish. I forget myself." She smiled, and it dazzled the room a shade too brightly. "I came from Port Said with a lady who swore by this brand. Perhaps I have been infected." Eleanor arrived, the children in tow, and for a heartbeat the room held its breath as twin faces regarded each other. Delight, caution, history, all indistinguishable and yet there. "Maggie," Eleanor said, but the word did not rise. It landed carefully. Margaret stepped forward and embraced her, and the children flung themselves at the novelty of two Miss Greys, which Mrs. Lane quelled with a murmur about muddy souls. "Will you stay?" Lady Florence asked, after the first greetings. "We can put you in the south room. You must be worn out." "If it is not an imposition," Margaret said. "I have been abroad so long, years it seems, and Eleanor's letters." She trailed off, glancing at her sister. Well, one longs to be two little girls again." "Letters are so unreliable," Eleanor said. "One is always interrupted." Miss Marple thought of the invitation with its altered hand. She said nothing and asked, instead, whether the village had changed since her last visit. Margaret answered readily, naming shops and lanes, and Miss Marple listened to how her knowledge halted at the precise time one might expect a girl to have left home. Newer alterations, a baker moved opposite the smithy, the rector replaced. Margaret glossed with the assurance of someone who had been told, not someone who had seen. "That is not an accusation," Miss Marple reminded herself. "It is only a fact." The afternoon sloped into that soft hour when servants make up fires and the light turns honest on old furniture. Miss Marple went up to her room, neat as a ship's cabin, and sat a moment with the window open to the lawn's green. A gardener wheeled a barrow across the gravel. Voices carried from below, Mrs. Lane's steady cluck, a younger voice, Benson half amused, and the scurry of two children escaping notice. Miss Marple took from her bag a length of knitting, pale wool that would one day be a baby's jacket for a neighbour, and let the small work settle her thoughts. She had that prickle between the shoulder blades that comes only occasionally, the sense that a pattern is present but not yet visible. Two sisters, two faces, and a household that had been steady and was now oddly taut, like a wire drawn through the hands and not yet twanged. The perfume was a remark, the letter a footnote, the glance about the room an aside. People, Miss Marple had discovered, told one everything if only one listened to the parts they did not mean to speak. At dressing bell, Miss Marple went down to the west corridor and, in so doing, passed a sitting room where a low conversation dipped and rose. She did not stop. There is a kind of listening that is unkind, and Miss Marple was scrupulous in her manners. But a few words, drifting like thistledown, cannot be helped. Not yet, and you promised. And then the crisp latch of a window being fastened from within. Dinner brought more of the Greystoke household, a retired Colonel Beverley with a moustache that seemed to have absorbed all the colour from the rest of him, Mr. James Bletchley, the land agent, conscientious down to his cuffs, and Dr. Lytton from the village, who had a good opinion of restorative tonics and an excellent one of his own prescriptions. Eleanor came down in a quiet black frock. Margaret wore pale green and the faintest glimmer of a necklace that caught the candlelight. Seating was the old fashion. Lady Florence presided, Miss Marple at her right, the Colonel opposite. Conversation was pleasantly dull at first. Leases, weather, a cow with notions, until the Colonel introduced a topic that jolted the table with the abruptness of a slammed drawer. "Travel," he announced to Margaret, "is not what it was. Cairo is ruined now with all those boulevards, lost its character entirely." "I suppose one must change with the world," Margaret said lightly. "The cafe in Sharia, she paused. "The road along the museum has excellent coffee still." The Colonel's eyes pinched. "Sharia Qasr al-Nil was bombed to ruin in 41, he said. "Cafes all gone then, rebuilt ugly afterward, but perhaps your ship docked before the change." He smiled with his mouth and not at all with his eyes. "Perhaps," Margaret said, and reached for her water. Eleanor spoke of the children's lessons, and the moment passed. Yet the table had gained an edge. Lady Florence, who believed in civility, as other women believe in recipes, shifted talk to local subscriptions, then to the fete. The servants moved in efficient silence. As a footman refilled Miss Marple's glass, she heard Mrs. Lane murmur behind her, "Curious as cats," and another woman's whisper, light, breathless, "I saw her in the blue dress. Truly I did, and not an hour later in the grey. I told you." "Keep your voice down, Ida," Mrs. Lane said, sharp as clipped thread. Miss Marple took a small mouthful of soup, looked across at Eleanor, who was buttering a roll with a carefulness that suggested she was somewhere else entirely, and at Margaret, who was charming the doctor into a treatise on nerve tonics. 2 dresses in an hour. Of course there might be 2 women to wear them. But servants, Miss Marple knew, were very precise about what they saw. A life below stairs sharpened the eye like a grindstone. If Ida had said it was the same woman, she did not mean similar. After dinner, Miss Marple sat in the smaller drawing room as the gentlemen drifted to the library, and the children composed letters at a little table under Eleanor's direction. Annabel's tongue stuck out at the corner of her mouth as she wrote. Christopher, with the bravado of small boys in new shoes, asked Margaret whether she had ever seen a lion. "I have," Margaret said promptly. "On a chain." He was sleepy and yawned, very big teeth. "Did you like it, Annabel?" Miss Marple asked, nodding towards the letter. "Writing to one's mother is a great art." "I am writing to Mamma in India," Annabel said with quiet pride. "Miss Grey says not too many adjectives." "A very sound rule," Miss Marple said. "Adjectives are like salt, useful, but one mustn't pour." Eleanor looked up, a shadow of amusement crossing her features. "You see, children, even Miss Marple agrees with grammar." A little later, with the children dispatched to bed, and Lady Florence called away to a note from the house steward, Margaret crossed to the mantelpiece to examine a photograph. Her silhouette was Eleanor's silhouette. Miss Marple, setting down her teacup, said in her mild way, "How strange to be 2 and yet always be taken for 1." Margaret's smile did not falter. "It is convenient sometimes. One can send one's sister to endure tedium while one escapes to dance." "And sometimes inconvenient," Miss Marple said. "One is blamed perhaps for the other's mischief." Margaret's gaze slid to the mirror above the mantel, then back. "We were very dull little girls, Miss Marple. Our mischief was limited to eating gooseberries before they were ripe." "Gooseberries," Miss Marple said, "can be quite unkind to the stomach." She let the silence sit a moment, just long enough for any uninvited truth to show its face. None did. Margaret only laughed and asked whether Miss Marple preferred lemon or plain biscuits. The moment passed as quietly as a moth behind a curtain. When the hour came to retire, Miss Marple found Mrs. Lane in the corridor marshalling a maid with hot water cans. "Soft water in your jug, Miss Marple," Mrs. Lane said. "We've had the lime scale the devil's own this month. You'll ring if you require anything." "You are very good," Miss Marple said. "A busy house." Mrs. Lane's mouth compressed. "Busier than it needs be." She lowered her voice. "Ida talks nonsense sometimes. Servants' tongues run away with them. Still—" She looked left and right. "I would swear I saw Miss Eleanor in the morning room after luncheon, blue dress, white collar, clear as the nose on my face. Then not an hour later, same lady in grey passing the east landing. Of course," she added, as if scolding herself, "of course it could have been the sister, only the sister had not yet arrived, not officially." She bobbed again and was gone before Miss Marple could say more. In her room, Miss Marple placed her hairpins neatly on the dressing table, unpinned her brooch, and sat a moment on the edge of the bed. The house hummed its small night noises, pipes ticking, distant footsteps, a door easing shut. Somewhere below, a clock marked the quarter hour. Miss Marple folded the day in her mind, the letter with its altered hand, the perfume Eleanor disliked, the Colonel's too precise correction, the servant's citing of the same woman in 2 dresses within an hour, and the quiet urgency of a phrase heard by accident. "Not yet. You promised." "2 little girls again," she murmured, repeating Margaret's wistful line. In Miss Marple's experience, the wish to become a child again rarely came without a quarrel with the present. She blew out the light and lay back. Sleep took her in the firm, no-nonsense way, of an old friend. She did not hear, an hour later, a door open along the east landing and close again, nor the faint clink of a glass placed carefully on silver in the library. But if she had been awake, Miss Marple would have noticed, because she always noticed, that the air along the corridor carried, for a moment, the bitter-sweet trace of orange. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Corridor. Greystoke Hall woke early, as houses do where children set the clocks with their feet. By 7, the corridors held the small, purposeful sounds of a country morning. Coals scuttled into grates, a mop whisked across tiles, a kettle sang in the distant kitchen. Miss Marple, whose habits were as tidy as her knitting bag, was dressed and at the window in time to see mist lifting from the lawn in ribbons, and a rook, black and solitary, hopping with curious dignity along the balustrade. A knock, light and respectful, brought Mrs. Lane with hot water and the day's courtesies. "Your breakfast tray will be up in a tick, miss. Cook thought you might prefer it quiet the first morning." "Most considerate," Miss Marple said. She noticed the housekeeper's eyes flick toward the corridor. "A brisk start, Mrs. Lane?" The woman hesitated, then aloud, "We've had a bit of rearrangement, miss. The south room's fire draws poorly. I've put Miss Margaret to the east chamber instead." "Near the morning room," Miss Marple observed mildly. Mrs. Lane gave a brief, uninformative smile. "Near enough." She set down the can and added, with a little burst, as of steam released, "Young Ida swore she heard someone trying the library door, long past a decent hour. Keys, miss. I cannot bear key-turning after midnight. Gives a house a peevish look." Miss Marple, who had never thought of houses as having expressions but found the idea perfectly right, said only, "You are wise to keep a good face on a place," and touched the other woman's arm in thanks. She took breakfast at a small table by the window, an egg, buttered toast, a slice of ham, and tea strong enough to reassure the weakest. While she ate, she reread Lady Florence's invitation, taken from her reticule for no particular reason, save that paper sometimes says more a second time. Halfway down the sheet, the memory pricked again. The little shift where the hand that wrote Eleanor Gray pressed harder, making a darker thread through the light weave of words. She laid the letter beside her plate and let the notion sit, like a bird on a fence, unchased. At 8:30, the schoolroom bell rang, a brisk, disciplined sound, and Miss Marple went along the corridor to meet it. The schoolroom had a clean chalk smell and the brisk cheerfulness of maps. In one corner, a globe leaned, faded, at the oceans. Eleanor was there in a plain dress the colour of stormlight. Annabel copied sums. Christopher bent over a reader with an expression of heroic endurance. "Good morning," Eleanor said, not pausing in the deft correction of a lopsided 7. "Good morning," Miss Marple returned, looking about as if at a familiar church. "I envy your globe, the world so obligingly contained." "Contained, perhaps," Eleanor said, "but not always faithful. The edges crumble." She spoke without inflection, yet Miss Marple felt something like a draught come through the words. She glanced at the mantel where a jar of late roses stood. Lady Florence liked little benches of colour in the house, and noted, under the floral sweetness, a faint, bitter fragrance that did not belong to roses. It was the same note she had caught the day before, only softened, as if passed from one sleeve to another. "Your mother likes letters," Miss Marple said to Annabel. "She will be eager for news of decimals." "Decimals are a ploy," Christopher announced gloomily, which made Annabel hide a smile. Eleanor's mouth twitched, and she returned to the copybook. "They are a ploy to understand the price of sweets," she said, which restored spirits considerably. Miss Marple took a chair by the window and, under the agreeable cover of praising penmanship, watched. Not the dramatic watching of policemen in books, but the quiet, housekeeping sort, how Eleanor's hand steadied lightly at the back of Annabel's chair without seeming to, how her eyes flicked to the corridor whenever footsteps passed, how Christopher's glance slid off his governess when she moved too near, like a boy stepping round a nettle patch he knew by heart. Children often betray where the nettles are. A light step sounded at the door, and Margaret appeared, bright as a postcard, in a pale morning frock. She brought with her a whiff of that bittersweet scent, stronger and more frivolous in the close schoolroom. "Lessons, darlings," she sang as if speaking to kittens. "How dreadfully industrious! Eleanor, Lady Florence asks if you might see to the luncheon arrangements. Mrs. Lane has been taken up by a fishmonger who insists he is owed for a haddock he has never seen." Eleanor rose. "Copy your lines, Christopher. Miss Marple, will you forgive a desertion?" "Desertions are the lifeblood of households," Miss Marple said gently. "One must constantly abandon one thing to rescue another." When Eleanor had gone, Margaret drifted to the mantel as if a magnet in the gilt drew her. She touched the stem of a rose, a petal loosened and clung to her glove. "Do you remember," she said to the children, "the glass menagerie Papa brought when we were small? All the animals on a tray? I broke the camel." "That was me," said Christopher honestly. "I broke the camel last Michaelmas." Margaret laughed lightly. How history repeats itself. She tilted her head, studying a pencil schedule pinned by the clock. Lessons, practice, a walk to the folly, luncheon, rest, French. Your days are beautifully full, chickabiddies. Idleness is the devil's wash day. Annabel regarded the visitor thoughtfully. "Miss Grey says idleness is the devil's cushion," she said. "Does she?" Margaret glanced sideways, the corner of her mouth tightening half a hair, then smoothed her face as if with a palm. "Well, the devil has many household goods." She pressed the rose again, leaving a slight bruising at the calyx. Miss Marple saw, with the little tightness of interest that comes when one's needle catches the exact thread, that Margaret's right glove bore a faint smudge of something chalky near the thumb, like a speck of residue from a window latch. The sort the East Corridor windows carried, one or two sticking if handled without a cloth. "You sleep well?" Miss Marple asked. The question was a string that might tug loose a knot. "Like a child in a hymn," Margaret said. "Though the house murmurs." She gave a small shiver meant for charming. "I had forgotten how English houses whisper to one." "English houses do not like strangers," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "They ask questions of one's shoes." Margaret smiled and turned the talk to Cairo bazaars for the children's entertainment. Coloured lanterns, sellers of figs, a boy with a monkey who tugged her sleeve. She described vividly and yet with a sketchiness of arrangement, as if she had heard the tale at a dinner table and built it from someone's hands. Miss Marple listened without appearing to, filing the unfamiliarities beside other small filings. Later in the passage, Miss Marple encountered Dr. Lytton taking his constitutional down the carpet with the proprietary air of country doctors who know every stairs creak. He bowed, sensible and brisk. "You find the house well, Miss Marple?" "Very comfortable," she said. "Lady Florence is improved for having those grandchildren about her," he pronounced. "Grandchildren lengthen one's leash on life." He lowered his voice. "The new sister, returned from foreign parts, seems lively." "Travel frays the hem," Miss Marple said. "Sometimes it is a new hem altogether." He blinked, uncertain whether to laugh, then did so and asked whether a tonic might suit her constitution. Miss Marple assured him it would not. She made for the morning room, drawn more by instinct than intention, and found Mrs. Lane with a basket of linen and a face that suggested the haddock had been conquered. "I'll just air these napkins in the light, miss. Sunshine's better than any dresser." Nature is a great laundress, Miss Marple agreed. She moved to the window. The latch was polished bright where fingers had worried it. A film of pale dust lay on the sash rail, with 2 fresh smears crossing through it, side by side, as though a gloved hand had braced there recently. "Window sticks," Mrs. Lane said. "Won't be right till we have a man up the scaffolding. I keep my girls from forcing it. One crack in the pane, and her ladyship would hear my obituary toll." She paused, and the conscientiousness in her eyes wavered into curiosity. "Miss Marple, if a person meant to take a breeze without drawing attention, she'd choose a door, wouldn't she? Windows creak like mice." "A person," Miss Marple said, "chooses whatever habit has served her before. Some people always try windows first." "'Tis quiet as a church in the small hours," Mrs. Lane murmured, almost to herself, "except when it isn't." A bustle of voices in the hall announced the land agent, and, behind him, Colonel Beverley. The latter's arrival put a brittle sheen on the air. He had the look of a man who had noticed something yesterday and come to verify it today. "Morning, Mrs. Lane. Miss Marple?" He took the room in at his sweep, napkins, windows, Miss Marple's harmlessness. "Lady Florence?" he asked. "In the library, sir," Mrs. Lane said, smoothing linen with extra care. "With Mr. Bletchley." The Colonel's moustache flickered. He turned to Miss Marple with the air of a man setting feelers. "So, Mrs. Marple, how do you find our little corner? Not too dull for a lady from St. Mary Mead?" "I like dull places," Miss Marple said. "They are so instructive." "Quite," he said, as if she had confessed to a vice. "One sees everything in them, unfortunately." When he had gone, Mrs. Lane gave a short, contained sniff. "That one has had a burr under his saddle since he came down last month. Papers in that case of his like a lawyer, knows where it needn't be." Miss Marple did not ask whose business the nose occupied. She knew that if a colonel began to prod, his shadow would show eventually. Instead, she wandered, without appearing to wander, towards the small writing desk in the corner. It bore a locked pigeonhole and, upon the blotter, a pale smear shaped like the crescent of a wrist, where perfume had mixed with dust. She leaned as if to admire the view and caught, in the blotter's corner, a ghost of indentations, 3 words pressed hard, and then torn off with the page. "Not yet." Promise, it was only the faintest impression. One could read many things in such whispers. She did not bend closer. Curiosity is best fed not with snatching, but with patience. It fattens of its own accord. By noon, the house gathered like a tide for luncheon. Lady Florence sat with more colour than the night before, though her gaze slid now and then to the door as if expecting an addition to the company. Eleanor, efficient and invisible in the domestic sense, ensured plates arrived and vanished as if ordained. Margaret sparkled, telling a lively story about a young naval officer who mistook her for his cousin at a Suez dance. The children glowed under the unusual liberty of eating with the grown-ups. Midway through, Colonel Beverley addressed Margaret abruptly. "You came in by Southampton, I understand. A tedious custom house." "So dull I vowed never to bring anything taxable again," Margaret said easily. "Even earrings feel like contraband after an hour in a queue." "Curious," the Colonel said in a tone of bland observation that fooled no one, "how those who avoid taxes often forget to remove the price tags." His eyes dipped just once to the small necklace at her throat, not to the stones, they were modest, but to the clasp, where, if one looked very closely, a thread-like scrap of stiff paper clung. Margaret's fingers rose lightly, as though to brush a non-existent itch. When they lowered, the bluish speck had gone. She smiled at the doctor and asked something about stock powders for seasickness. Dr. Lytton obligingly expanded into pharmaceutical weather. Miss Marple buttered a roll and thought of indented words on blotting paper and chalk on a glove, and the way children ducked nettles on known paths. After the meal, in the cool of the long gallery, she found herself beside Eleanor as they looked at a portrait. The sort of Georgian gentleman who had never learned humility. "Your sister seems very happy to be home," Miss Marple said. "Margaret is always happy where there is company," Eleanor replied. Her tone was even, but the words landed with a minute weight, as if placed on a scale. "She remembers faces, places less so." "You have a good memory for places," Miss Marple said. "For doors," Eleanor said quietly, "and for the sounds people make when they think they are alone." A little silence followed. From far away, the schoolroom clock chimed the quarter. Somewhere above, a door closed with a soft, definite finality, like a chapter ending itself. Eleanor seemed to listen to it, then turned and said with perfect composure, "I must see that the children have their walk. You are welcome to join us." "In a little while," Miss Marple said. When she was alone, she stood at the gallery window and watched two women cross the sunlit gravel, one in pale green, one in sober blue, together and yet not together. Their shadows lay across the drive for a moment like the slats of a blind, and then dissolved as they passed under the elms. Miss Marple felt that familiar twinge behind the breastbone that told her a story had begun to speak in the house, and that by evening it would have moved several inches nearer its truth. Chapter 3. A Sudden Death. The weather at Greystoke Hall had been unsettled all morning, not with rain, but with that faint, restless air that makes doors murmur on their hinges and sets curtains lifting at the hem. Even the children's voices in the schoolroom sounded lower, subdued by the pressure in the sky. By 9:30, the house had settled into its weekday rhythm. Lady Florence dictating letters in the library, Eleanor with the children on the terrace for copywork in the sun, Margaret somewhere between the rose garden and the morning room, her laughter carried in thin threads through the open windows. Miss Marple had stationed herself in the smaller drawing room with a basket of mending. She found mending in a stranger's house particularly instructive, for here, in the way a cuff had been turned or a seam let out, one could read much about the wearer's habits and the household's economy. As she stitched a missing button to a cuff that had clearly been mended before, she could hear the rhythmic thump of the billiard table from the games room down the passage, the Colonel's steady cough between shots, and the occasional clink of glasses from the sideboard. Shortly before 11, Benson the footman passed by, his tread unusually quick. Moments later, there was a sound, not the shout of surprise one hears when something is dropped, but the sharp, high note of alarm. It was followed by hurried steps, a door thrown open, and then a heavier tread pounding down the corridor. Miss Marple set aside her needlework and rose. The library, she found, was in a state of sudden disorder. Colonel Beverley lay slumped sideways in the leather armchair near the desk, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes half open but unseeing. A small glass rested against his slack fingers, a few drops of amber liquid still clinging to its curve. On the carpet at his feet, a letter opener lay askew, its tip pointing toward the hearthrug. Beside it, a square of blotting paper had been dragged halfway from the stand, one corner bent as though pulled in haste. Lady Florence stood a pace away, her face drawn and pale. "He was speaking only a moment ago," she said faintly. "And then he was gone." Dr. Lytton was already kneeling beside the chair, his hand pressed to the Colonel's wrist. After a brief interval, he straightened with the solemn, brisk air of a man confirming what he has already guessed. "I'm afraid it's no use. He's gone." "Heart?" Lady Florence asked, still holding herself as if a draught had caught her. "Possibly," the doctor said, "but—" He glanced at the glass in the Colonel's hand, his nostrils twitching almost imperceptibly. "We shall have to call the authorities. This is not something I can sign away without question." Benson, hovering by the door, looked as though the ground had shifted under his feet. "Shall I fetch Inspector Walsh, my lady?" Lady Florence hesitated. Yes, Benson, and close the door until he comes." Miss Marple, meanwhile, had taken a slow, unhurried turn about the room. The Colonel's position interested her, the left hand loosely resting on the chair arm, the right still cradling the glass. His head was turned slightly toward the desk, where several papers lay, most in neat piles, but one spread open as if recently read. The inkwell was closed, the pen wiped clean, and yet, curiously, the blotter beneath bore a fresh, dark patch, not fully dried. On the far corner of the desk, near the uncurtained window, a square space of polished wood stood out against the faint dust that had gathered on the rest of the surface. Something had been there until very recently, and had been removed. She noticed, too, that the ashtray beside the chair held only a single stub, yet the faint tang of cigar smoke still hung in the air, stronger than one stub could have produced. Someone else, then, had been smoking here, and not long ago. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her face bright with curiosity that dulled to shock as her eyes took in the scene. "Oh, good heavens! Colonel Beverley?" She stepped forward, the faint scent of her perfume preceding her, and looked from the body to her sister, who had just arrived behind her with the children in tow. Eleanor's face was pale, but still, she moved quickly to herd the children back. "Upstairs, both of you," she said, her tone quiet, but leaving no room for refusal. Annabel's lip trembled. Christopher opened his mouth to speak, but thought better of it, and obeyed. "Did anyone see the Colonel after breakfast?" the doctor asked. "I passed him in the gallery about an hour ago," Margaret said. "He had that battered briefcase under his arm. I thought he was off to look at estate papers." Lady Florence's brow furrowed. "I saw him in here with a letter. He seemed, not troubled exactly, but intent. He asked me to leave him for a few minutes." Miss Marple, still standing near the desk, traced a fingertip lightly along the edge of the open paper without moving it. The letterhead bore the crest of a London solicitor's firm. From her angle, she could make out only a few words. Matter of the Grey case, highly irregular. The Grey case. Her mind tucked it away beside other scraps. The altered hand in Florence's letter, the perfume Eleanor was supposed to dislike, the maid's insistence on seeing Miss Eleanor twice in different dresses. Benson returned with Inspector Walsh, a thick-set man in a brown suit whose briskness did not disguise the fact that he disliked any disturbance to his Sunday arrangements. He took in the scene with a glance, asked the necessary questions, and had the room cleared except for himself, Dr. Lytton, and Miss Marple, whom Lady Florence insisted should remain. "Doctor says heart trouble's possible," Walsh said, bending over the Colonel. "I'll grant you he's a bit flushed for a man in death. What's in that glass?" "Whiskey," Dr. Lytton said, "but there's a scent I don't quite like. Bitter." Walsh sniffed, frowned. "You think it's—" "I think," the doctor interrupted, "that we should send it for analysis, but I doubt the Colonel poured this himself." Miss Marple did not speak, but her eyes went to the side table where the decanter stood. Its stopper was slightly askew, the kind of imperfection most people overlook, but which a tidy man like Beverley would not have left. More telling still, a second glass sat there, empty, but with the faintest crescent of moisture along its rim, as though it had been set down only minutes before discovery. "Who was last with him?" Walsh asked. Lady Florence hesitated. "I cannot say for certain. I was in the morning room with Mr. Bletchley until about 20 minutes ago. Eleanor was on the terrace with the children, and Margaret—" She turned to the younger woman. Margaret's smile was quick, almost defensive. "I was in the rose garden, I believe, alone." "You believe?" Walsh repeated. "I mean, I was walking. It is possible someone saw me." Her tone made it plain she did not intend to search for witnesses. Eleanor stood very still. "I did not see her in the garden," she said, simply. Miss Marple's eyes moved between them, noting how Margaret's hands clasped too tightly in front of her, and how Eleanor's gaze did not waver, as though she were holding a steady point on a horizon. Walsh, clearly irritated, instructed Benson to take note of all comings and goings from the library until further notice. "And keep that door locked," he added. "Nothing in or out without my say." When they had filed out, Miss Marple lingered a moment, her eyes returning to the desk. She was thinking not of the body. Death, after all, has its own certainty, but of the gap in the dust where something had been, the letter with its hint of scandal, and the second glass that no one had yet claimed. She bent, as if to retrieve a dropped pin, and her eyes caught a faint smear on the carpet beside the desk, the palest trace of powder, as if a glove had brushed there. Outside in the hall, voices carried low and taut. "What were you promised?" a woman's voice said, the same words she had heard, indistinctly, the evening before. This time, though, there was no mistaking the sharp edge in them, nor the note of fear that followed. And when she turned the corner, there was only the empty stretch of corridor and the sound of a door closing, softly but firmly, somewhere along the east wing. Miss Marple stood for a moment, looking down the hall, her knitting bag in hand as if she had merely been passing. But inside, the pieces of the morning, the hurried footman, the bitter scent in the glass, the missing object from the desk, and that curiously tense exchange between the twins, began to arrange themselves into a pattern. It was not yet clear, but the pattern was there. And she, more than most, knew the value of watching it form before anyone realized it was visible. Chapter 4. The Story from Abroad. Inspector Walsh, having secured the library and sent Benson on a round of inquiries that looked satisfyingly official, made a show of departing for the station to set the wheels turning. His exit had the effect of a kettle removed from the hob. The immediate noise died away, but the steam remained. Lady Florence, pale and upright, insisted the children keep to their routine. "Lessons," she said, in a voice that would have sent a regiment to bed, and then a short walk with Miss Grey. She meant Eleanor. Margaret had taken herself upstairs with a hand to her brow that suggested either grief or calculation, and Miss Marple, though not unfeeling, had learned long ago that both expressions required the same calm silence from onlookers. When the household had steadied to its post-incident rhythm, a hush with seams, Miss Marple made her unobtrusive way to the back stairs. On the second landing, a little window sat half open, its catch polished by many uncertain fingers. The sill bore a faint bloom of the pale dust she had noticed elsewhere. Two smudged crescents crossed it, remarkably like the marks on the morning room sash, a gloved hand bracing for leverage. Below, the service path ran to the kitchen garden gate. It would be quite possible, she thought, for someone to slip from the east corridor by way of a half-stuck window without passing the principal hall at all. "Doors," Eleanor had said, "and the sounds people make when they think they are alone." Windows, too, were a kind of door, favoured by certain tempers. In the schoolroom, Eleanor kept to her measured order. The children bent over copybooks. The air smelled of chalk and clean wood. Margaret did not appear. When Miss Marple slipped in, the governess acknowledged her with the smallest nod, a recognition between women who had chosen to keep their thoughts folded. "Annabel," Miss Marple said mildly, "do you think the letter to India should include news of decimals today, or would a description of the rook on the balustrade be of greater interest?" Annabel, who had observed more than adults allowed for, said, "Both," with grave diplomacy. "Quite so," Miss Marple murmured, and took a chair by the window. She did not speak further, but in the quiet she heard a small sigh escape Eleanor, the sort one makes when a tray one has balanced for a long time tilts a fraction and rights itself again. At 11, with the children dispatched for their walk under Ida's watchful eye, Miss Marple found the housekeeper in the passage folding linen. Mrs. Lane was not a woman to allow agitation to wrinkle a napkin, but the muscles at the corners of her mouth had set into little hooks. "I suppose," Miss Marple said, considering a stack of tablecloths as if their hems contained wisdom, "that the Colonel's briefcase has gone missing?" Mrs. Lane's eyes flicked up. Her hands did not stop. "It had better not have," she said. "He kept it in the library, tucked under the side table, so tidy one forgot it. But I never dusted around it without thinking men carry too much paper to justify their breathing."
"Men do love paper," Miss Marple agreed. "One hears it whisper to them." "Whispering or no," Mrs. Lane said, "it's not there now." She let out the smallest, fiercest breath. "And I'll add this, Miss Marple, though it's not my habit to embroider, I'd stake my best napery I heard the library key turn twice yesterday, late, twice with a pause between, as if the hand on it were less certain the second time." "Late last night?" Miss Marple asked. "Near enough to make a maid walk quicker," Mrs. Lane returned. "Young Ida said she thought the east corridor window had a mind of its own soon after. I told her not to be fanciful and to mind her shoes, but—" The hooks at her mouth softened. "But I heard it myself. Metal minds its own business. Wood speaks." "Wood speaks," Miss Marple repeated and patted the tablecloths as though they might answer back. She went next to the morning room, where a jumble of flowers waited to be restored to loveliness. Margaret stood at the mantel in a pale house frock, pinching the bruised calyx of a rose with unnecessary determination. She started when Miss Marple entered, then covered the movement with a smile. "How dreadful all this is," she said quickly. "Poor Colonel, so sudden. Will there be an inquest?"
"There is always an inquest where a sudden death finds a glass in its hand," Miss Marple said. "You slept badly?" Margaret laughed, a fraction too bright. "Is it so obvious? I suppose foreign beds ruin one for English ones. Too soft, too many pillows." "Foreign beds do surprise," Miss Marple allowed. Her gaze drifted, apparently aimless, to Margaret's right glove, lying carelessly on the table. A fine chalky bloom marked the thumb seam. "And foreign cities." "Oh, I adore Cairo," Margaret began, but caught herself. "Adored, I mean." She moved to the open window and touched the sill. "One forgets the air here has a temperature." "One forgets many things," Miss Marple said. "Street names, for instance." Margaret looked over, and for a moment, only the length of a blink, her eyes sharpened. Then she laughed again and said something aimless about bazaars. Miss Marple said nothing further. One can do too much with a net and frighten the fish. By noon, the inspector had returned, trailed by a younger constable who held a notebook as if it were a shield. Walsh asked Lady Florence, quite courteously, for the use of the morning room for statements. People went in and came out with different faces. The doctor, with an air of offended expertise, Mr. Bletchley counting his words like coins, Benson solemn and the colour of candle grease. When Eleanor emerged, she was composed. When Margaret followed, she was smiling. Miss Marple thought of a stage curtain drawn back and forward across the same scene. "Mrs. Marple," Walsh called, after she had contrived to be on the landing at the right moment. "You're a sensible woman. Did you observe anything this morning that struck you?" "I observed," Miss Marple said, "that the decanter stopper was not seated as a tidy gentleman would leave it, that there were 2 glasses with the smell of whiskey, not one, and that something had been removed from the Colonel's desk, leaving a square in the dust." Walsh scratched behind his ear. You'd make a constable unhappy, ma'am. You see too much." "One cannot help being old," Miss Marple said, and let him think that was all. After luncheon, muted, economical, Miss Marple begged leave to take the air. It was a short walk down the elm-lined drive to the village, and she liked the way the shop fronts, unself-conscious as faces without mirrors, arranged their baskets and brooms onto the pavement. A brass bell announced her into the lending library and reading room, a low-ceilinged, stubbornly clean place with potted geraniums and newspapers pegged to wooden frames like trout on sticks. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Peabody, who ran the place with a proprietary love for both fiction and disinfectant. "Back again to rescue our detective stories from neglect?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple smiled, "but today I have a fancy for old news." Mrs. Peabody pursed lips that looked as if they had never said anything indelicate. "Shipping lists, society weddings, death notices." "Foreign scandals," Miss Marple said, the phrase as gentle as tea. "Something from, 2 to 3 years ago, gossipy if possible, Egypt perhaps, or the Levant." Mrs. Peabody, who despised gossip in conversation but revered it in print, brought out a stack of illustrated weeklies and a bound volume of The Times. Miss Marple settled into a chair by the window, her hands making themselves small over the heavy pages. She scanned with the peculiar speed of those who have looked for lost needles all their lives. 2 columns in, she found a notice that snagged like a hook. "Mysterious circumstances at Mardi, British financier found dead." The item was brief. Foreign deaths were always brief, but thorough enough to set her mind stitching. Mr. Arnold Tripp, an exporter of machine parts, had been discovered in his study after a dinner party, glass at hand, window open to the garden. No sign of forced entry. Servants testified to hearing the study door locked at 11:30. A nurse companion to Mr. Tripp's ailing wife had attended the lady upstairs. The nurse was English, her name Miss E. Grey. Spelled thus without the E. Miss Marple sat very still. Then she turned a page and another. A follow-up note weeks later reported that Miss E. Grey had returned to England to attend to a sick relative, leaving employment with a satisfactory reference. No inquest verdict was printed. Foreign authorities, it said, had recorded natural causes aggravated by indigestion. There was a photograph, grainy, careless, of Mr. Tripp's villa. A terrace, a line of dark palms, a window whose latch, she fancied, might stick in damp weather. She closed the book with tender care, as if not to wake something, and went next door to Mr. Challow's barber shop, where newspapers lost grace and gained news. Mr. Challow, a guard of village facts, was in conversation with the postmistress about the vicar's sermon on thrift. Miss Marple waited, patient and porous, until the talk had puddled and could be stepped over. "Mr. Challow," she said, "have you heard of a lady returned to the Hall, Miss Margaret Grey, from abroad?" "Oh, we've all heard," he said, delighted. "Pretty as a ticket. Mind you, that sister of hers, Miss Eleanor, she's the one with the backbone. We had 2 aerograms last month for an E. Grey, care of Lady Florence, Egypt stamps and a foreign smell. Postmistress says she knows her perfumes." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Perfumes do make an impression. And the return address?" "First one from Mardi," he said promptly. "Second-hand stamped at Alexandria. Funny thing, the first aerogram came 3 days after another letter from Egypt for the same name, but different writing. I notice these things. The foreign hands, they go skinny on the loops." "Quite," Miss Marple said. "One mustn't waste loops in hot climates." She left the village with the afternoon sun beginning to slope and the sense, not yet firm, but gathering, that her little pile of scraps was arranging itself into a picture. 2 sisters with a habit of exchange. A foreign employer dead with a glass by his hand and a window open to the garden. a nurse companion named E. Grey, no E, who had left quietly. Aerograms to E. Grey, E. restored, arriving in duplicate hands. A colonel with a solicitor's letter about the Grey case, now dead in a library with whiskey that smelled wrong, and a second glass set down with careless haste. At the hall gates, she paused. Margaret was coming along the drive from the rose garden, hatless, charming a gardener, out of a cutting with 10 words and a laugh. Eleanor walked behind her, a step and a width of gravel apart, the children flanking her like commas. Between the sisters lay a space that had once been a path one could tread without looking. Now it was nettle-grown. People took such paths only in emergencies, or to hide. Back in the house, she found Lady Florence alone in the small drawing-room, her hand on the back of a chair, as if the furniture kept her upright. "You have the look of a woman who has sat with newspapers," Lady Florence said, with a wryness that made Miss Marple love her a little. "Have you learned anything that will spare me a scandal?" "I have learned," Miss Marple said gently, "that truth seldom spares us, but that it is tidier than falsehood. May I ask, how long have you known of Eleanor's sister abroad?" "Years," Lady Florence said, wearily honest. "The Greys came to me with a reference from a clergyman in Dorset. Eleanor presented herself. Margaret was, well, adventurous. I did not pry. One can only borrow honesty where it is offered. If I am guilty, it is of wanting the children settled." "That is a virtue," Miss Marple said, "but virtues do sometimes make convenient curtains." Lady Florence's grip on the chair tightened. "Do you believe—" "I believe," Miss Marple said, with the steadiness of someone smoothing a bed for a fevered child, "that the Colonel knew something awkward and wished to be paid for knowing it. Or perhaps he meant to be gallant and blundered into the middle of a story that wanted no witnesses. In any case, we must proceed as if no one is lying, only telling different parts with different courage." The door opened on a hush of carpet. Eleanor stood there, pale but contained. "Inspector Walsh would like us all in the library at 5:30, she said. "He has found the Colonel's briefcase." "Where?" Lady Florence asked. "In the morning room," Eleanor answered. "Behind the escritoire. The lock is broken." She looked at Miss Marple, and for the first time the careful cover of calm lifted enough to show the outline beneath. "There are letters inside, some with our name." "Then," Miss Marple said, rising, "let us go and hear what they have to say. Letters speak more plainly when they are read aloud." As they crossed the corridor together, a breath of bitter orange drifted past, feather-light and inescapable. Somewhere behind them, in the empty east wing, a window creaked and settled. The house, attentive and unblinking, seemed... Chapter 5. The Servant's Tale. The rain began just before 5:30, pattering against the tall library windows as Inspector Walsh gathered the household. It was a thin, persistent rain that blurred the line of the parkland trees and made the lamps inside seem a shade too bright. The Colonel's chair stood empty now, but his absence had the peculiar density of a presence. The desk, cleared of the more sensitive papers, still bore the square of polished wood where something had sat until that morning. On the table beside Walsh lay the battered briefcase. The broken lock yawned slightly, the metal tongue bent. Walsh stood behind it like a judge preparing to read a verdict. "Right," he began, his voice clipped but not unkind. "This was found in the morning room, tucked behind the escritoire. Lock's been forced, could have been with a small screwdriver or even a sturdy letter opener. Inside we have correspondence, personal and otherwise, belonging to the late Colonel Beverley. Some of it concerns a certain matter abroad. Names have been mentioned." His eyes, without hurry, rested on Eleanor and Margaret in turn. Margaret crossed her legs with a composure just shy of insolence. Eleanor's hands rested in her lap, fingers loosely interlaced, but the knuckles were pale. Lady Florence kept her gaze fixed on the fire, her profile rigid. "We'll come to those letters in due course," Walsh said. "First, I need everyone to state where they were between 10:30 and 11:30 this morning." The responses came in order. Lady Florence, "In the morning room with Mr. Bletchley until a note from the steward took her to the kitchens." Mr. Bletchley, "With Lady Florence until she left, then to his office by the stables." Dr. Lytton, "Calling on an elderly patient in the village." Eleanor, "On the terrace with the children and later in the schoolroom." Margaret, "Walking in the rose garden, though, as before, she offered no witness to confirm it." Benson, "Delivering a message to the gardener, then taking fresh linen upstairs." Mrs. Lane, "Supervising the cleaning of the silver in the pantry." Ida, the under-housemaid, "Fetching coal for the east wing fireplaces." It was Ida's turn to speak that made Walsh's expression sharpen. She was a slim, dark-eyed girl of about 20, who twisted her apron hem as she spoke. "I was in the east wing, sir, about 20 past 11. Heard the library door close, not slam, just careful-like. I thought it queer seeing as the Colonel was in there and not one for opening his own doors. I went along a bit, and I could have sworn I saw Miss Eleanor, beg pardon, miss, coming out of the morning room in the blue dress. Only thing is—" She swallowed, darting a glance at Margaret. "Not an hour before I'd seen her, or someone the spit of her, on the east landing in grey, same height, same step, carrying something under her arm, too far to call out, and I had the coal scuttle." A small silence followed. Eleanor's voice, when it came, was calm. "You must have seen my sister, Ida. We are alike." "That's just it, miss," Ida said earnestly. "The way she carried herself, same as you. Miss Margaret, you walk different, like you're listening to music." Her cheeks flamed at her own daring. "Beg pardon." Margaret smiled faintly, though the skin around her eyes had tightened. "What a poetic description, Ida." Walsh's pencil scratched in his notebook. "So you saw both sisters, or someone dressed as both sisters, in the space of an hour?" "Yes, sir." Mrs. Lane gave a brisk cough. "I told her to mind her coal and not her fancies," she said, though the slight frown between her brows betrayed that she took the story more seriously than her words allowed. Miss Marple, who had been seated quietly in a low chair by the hearth, allowed her knitting needles to click once, lightly. "People do often see more than they are prepared to believe," she said, in her mild way, "particularly when the thing seen requires an explanation not yet provided." Walsh gave her a glance that might have been half amusement, half invitation. "You've had dealings with the staff today, ma'am?" "A few words here and there," Miss Marple said. "It is remarkable how windows and doors make themselves the confidants of servants." Margaret laughed softly. "You make it sound as though the doors are plotting, Miss Marple." "Doors," Miss Marple said, "do not plot, but they do remember, especially the ones that creak." Walsh, uninterested in philosophy, brought the focus back to the briefcase. Inside were 3 letters from a solicitor in London regarding a case in Egypt, the Grey case, as it's referred to. There are also notes in the Colonel's hand, suggesting he intended to speak to someone in this house about the matter. One of those notes, dated yesterday, reads, "Arrange meeting with M urgent, matter of identity." The M could be either Miss Margaret or Miss Marple for that matter, but I'll wager it wasn't the latter. Margaret's expression did not change, but a flush crept along her throat. Eleanor sat utterly still. Walsh closed the briefcase. "Until we can verify movements and have the doctor's analysis of the whiskey, I'll ask that both Miss Grey and Miss Margaret Grey remain on the property. Benson will keep the library locked." The household was dismissed. In the corridor, Ida hovered uncertainly until Mrs. Lane shooed her towards the back stairs, Miss Marple, taking her time to gather her knitting, found herself walking alongside the housekeeper. "She's a good girl, Ida," Mrs. Lane said grudgingly. "But she sees things, not always the things she should. This morning she told me she heard voices in the east wing. 2 women, low and quick, went quiet when she passed. One of them said, 'We can't keep it up much longer.'" That was before the Colonel. Mrs. Lane broke off. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "And she's sure they were women's voices?" "As sure as she's of her own." Mrs. Lane glanced toward the stairs, lowering her voice further. "She says one sounded like Miss Eleanor. The other, well, she's not saying, might be loyalty or fear." That evening, as the rain deepened into a steady drumbeat, Miss Marple took a solitary turn along the east corridor. She passed the half-stuck window, noting again the smudges where a gloved hand had braced against the sill. Farther along, a small table held a vase of roses, their petals beginning to curl. A faint trace of perfume clung to them, not the garden's honest scent, but that bitter-sweet note she had learned to expect when Margaret was near. And yet Margaret, she knew, was in the drawing-room with Lady Florence, being voluble about opera. The house seemed to press its silence against her as she paused there. Somewhere below, a clock struck 9. Miss Marple stood very still, letting the scraps assemble themselves. Ida's sighting of Eleanor, twice in different dresses, the voices in the east wing, the glove-smudged window, the perfume that did not belong to the governess, the solicitor's letters in the Colonel's case. A faint creak came from the far end of the corridor. Miss Marple turned her head just enough to see a shadow slip past the bend toward the servants' stairs. Tall enough to be either sister. Moving quickly, but not in panic, the kind of pace that spoke of someone who believed she was unseen. Miss Marple let her gaze drop, her posture that of an elderly woman merely considering whether her feet wished to go farther. But her mind, quiet and exact, was measuring distance, timing steps, and tucking away the memory of the perfume trace that hung for a moment in the air before the corridor emptied again. Chapter 6. A Past Crime resurfaces. Morning broke pale and thin, the rain having washed the lawns to a deeper green. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, and from her window Miss Marple saw a gardener stooping over the border, cutting away the bruised heads of roses. It was the sort of day when the world looked cleaner, but not necessarily kinder. She had just finished dressing when Benson knocked and entered with a breakfast tray. His manner, as always, was polite, but his eyes had the guarded look of someone trying not to hold a secret in plain sight. "Anything amiss this morning, Benson?" Miss Marple asked mildly. He hesitated. "Only that Inspector Walsh was here before 8, miss." "Spoke to her ladyship in private?" "He had papers with him, letters, I think." "Old ones." "From the Colonel's case?" "I wouldn't know, miss," Benson said, though his tone implied he knew very well. Her ladyship looked, well, as if she'd been up most of the night. When he had gone, Miss Marple ate slowly, thinking of the papers. Letters were the skeleton keys to the past. In the right hands, they unlocked more than their authors intended. After breakfast, she found herself in the smaller drawing room with Lady Florence, who was wearing a dark wool gown and no jewellery. Her expression was taut. "You will hear things," Lady Florence said without preamble. "Walsh is persistent, and the letters in the Colonel's briefcase will make people talk. Some of them refer to an unfortunate incident abroad. I do not care for it to be bandied about." "I understand," Miss Marple said gently, "but gossip grows fastest in the dark." Lady Florence's lips tightened. It was a matter involving a Mr. Arnold Tripp, a British financier in Egypt. He died suddenly, so it was said, after dinner one night. His nurse companion at the time was an Englishwoman named Miss E. Grey. She returned to England soon after. No charges, no trial, just whispers. E. Grey, Miss Marple repeated. Without an E? Yes. And I do not know, cannot know which sister it was. Before Miss Marple could answer, the door opened and Margaret entered. She wore a pale green blouse and looked as fresh as if the last 2 days had not happened. Inspector Walsh wants to see Eleanor, she announced. I passed him in the hall. Why not you? Lady Florence asked. Margaret's smile was quick. Perhaps he is saving me for dessert. When she had gone, Lady Florence murmured, she was always the more adaptable. Miss Marple knew better than to ask whether that was praise. In the library, Inspector Walsh was leaning over the desk, studying one of the solicitor's letters. Eleanor sat opposite him, her hands folded tightly. This letter, Walsh was saying, is from Tripp's own solicitor, mentions a sum of money, £200, sent to an account in England in the name of E. Grey. Does that mean anything to you? No, Eleanor said, her voice even. I have never had such an account. Walsh's eyes flicked up. Your sister, perhaps? I cannot speak for Margaret's affairs. Miss Marple, who had entered without fuss, took a seat in the corner. It is curious, she observed, how people sometimes use another's name when they wish to hide their own, especially when the names are so easily mistaken. Eleanor glanced at her, but her face did not change. Walsh pressed on. We also have the Colonel's notes, mentions meeting M urgently. He didn't say why, but he underlined the word identity. Any idea what that means? No, Eleanor said again. Miss Marple thought she saw the faintest flicker in the governess's eyes, less a lie than a door closed against a draught. Later that morning, Miss Marple went down to the village, ostensibly to return a book to the lending library. In truth, she wanted to speak again with Mrs. Peabody, who seemed to have an unadvertised archive in her head. Mahdi Egypt, Mrs. Peabody said, turning the memory over like a coin. Yes, I remember. That case was in the Illustrated London News. Pretty nurse accused in whispers of, what's the phrase? Helping along a sick man. Never proven, of course. The photographs made her look angelic, which is always suspicious. And her name? Miss Marple asked. E. Grey, no E at the end. The paper said she'd left for England under some pretext. There was another woman mentioned too, dark-haired, more lively, stayed on in Cairo for a time before vanishing from the record. Miss Marple tucked this away. 2 women, one serious, one lively. The pattern was tightening. When she returned to the hall, the children were in the schoolroom, the sound of their recitation carrying faintly along the corridor. Miss Marple paused in the doorway. Eleanor was at the blackboard, chalk in hand. Margaret stood at the window, idly fingering the latch. Your sums are neat, Miss Marple said to Annabel. Miss Grey says untidy sums are bad for the mind, Annabel replied. Margaret smiled. And untidy minds are bad for sums. She let the latch fall and turned. I suppose Walsh will be sniffing around all day. I find it rather thrilling. Eleanor's back stiffened. A man is dead, Margaret. Yes, Margaret said lightly. And he was tedious. Life is short, sister dear. Miss Marple let the exchange settle. Then she said, I wonder, did either of you ever know a Mr. Arnold Tripp? Eleanor's chalk squeaked to a halt. Margaret's smile froze for half a heartbeat before she said, Can't say I did. Why? Oh, no reason, Miss Marple said. I only thought it an unusual name. That afternoon, Mrs. Lane came to her in the corridor. Miss Marple, she said, lowering her voice, you ought to know. Ida's been fretting, says she saw one of the ladies, can't swear which, coming out of the Colonel's room the night before he died, late, carrying a small tin or bottle. What sort of bottle? Miss Marple asked. Dark glass, the sort medicine comes in. And Ida told no one? She's frightened, Mrs. Lane said simply. Miss Marple nodded. Fear, she knew, was as good at closing mouths as it was at opening doors. By evening, the house seemed to have drawn in on itself. The rain returned, tapping at the windows. In the drawing room, Lady Florence took up her embroidery, while Margaret played a waltz on the piano. Eleanor sat reading by the fire, though she turned no pages. Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting in her lap, thinking of the foreign death, the money transfer, the bottle in the night, the perfume on a window latch. The sisters had been moving in each other's shadows for a long time, so long perhaps that even they no longer knew where one ended and the other began. But one thing she did know. The Colonel had learned something precise, and that knowledge had killed him as surely as any poison. Chapter 7. The drawing-room confrontation. The next day dawned clearer, though the air held a knife edge of cold. Inspector Walsh was back before breakfast, boots leaving damp prints on the marble hall. He brought with him a sheaf of typed pages, and the look of a man whose patience was being measured in inches. "Miss Marple," he said, catching her in the corridor, "you've an eye for what's out of place. I'd be grateful if you'd listen in this morning. We're getting close, I think." Close, Miss Marple reflected, could mean anything from a neat arrest to a muddle one couldn't sweep under the hearth rug. She agreed and found herself summoned to the large drawing room at 10 sharp. The household was gathered, Lady Florence upright on the sofa, Mr. Bletchley hovering at her shoulder, Dr. Lytton by the mantel, grave, Benson and Mrs. Lane standing near the door, Margaret and Eleanor side by side, their resemblance throwing every difference into sharper relief. Walsh took the hearthrug. "We've confirmed the Colonel's whiskey contained a significant amount of digitalis, foxglove, not the sort of thing one finds in the drinks cabinet." His gaze swept the room. A small bottle of the tincture was found in the waste bin of the East Wing bathroom yesterday afternoon. Label partly torn, but the chemist's name is still visible. Harper and Sons, Mahdi, Egypt. A ripple passed through the group. Margaret's hands remained folded in her lap, but Eleanor's fingers tightened on the arm of her chair. Walsh went on. "We've also confirmed that the Colonel's briefcase contained correspondence about a certain case in Mahdi 2 years ago, the death of a Mr. Arnold Tripp. Officially, natural causes, but our Colonel had a different opinion. He had notes suggesting he believed one of the Miss Greys, perhaps both, were involved. He was, it seems, looking for proof." "Then he found it," Lady Florence said quietly. Walsh gave a slow nod. "The question is, was that proof enough to frighten someone into shutting him up?" Margaret smiled, though it was a thin thing. "And you think that someone was one of us?" Walsh didn't answer directly. "We've witnesses who saw what they thought was Miss Eleanor, twice in different dresses the day before the murder, once in blue, once in grey, both within an hour. And late that night, a woman matching her height and build was seen leaving the Colonel's room with a small bottle in hand. Ida at the back flushed under the attention. "I only saw from the landing," she said, "but it was her walk. Could have been Miss Margaret dressed like her, I suppose." "That," Walsh said, "is the point. The two of you are near identical, which means an alibi from one might be an alibi for the other, if you were inclined to swap roles." Eleanor's eyes fixed on her lap. Margaret leaned back, an actress at ease in a part she knew. "Why would we do that?" "To cover for each other," Miss Marple said gently. The room turned to her. She sat in a low chair near the window, knitting idle in her lap. Twins are a rare thing, and they grow up with a kind of shorthand. They can borrow each other's voices, mannerisms, even handwriting. It's a comfort, until it's a danger. Margaret's mouth quirked. "You make it sound as though we've been plotting since infancy." "Not plotting," Miss Marple said. "Protecting. I think one of you came back from Egypt under a cloud, and the other took her place for a time, here, in England, so that people might forget the shape of the story. But when the Colonel recognized the past, the switch became more than a convenience. Walsh flipped open his notebook. We've got other bits. The decanter stopper not seated properly, sign of someone pouring in a hurry. 2 glasses on the table, one for the Colonel, one for the visitor. And we've got the chemist in Mardi confirming a Miss E. Grey bought digitalis tincture for a heart patient shortly before leaving the country. That could be anyone, Margaret said quickly. Indeed, Miss Marple said. Anyone, but only if anyone had reason to shop at Harper & Sons in Mardi. Eleanor looked up at last. Her face was pale, but her voice steady. Are you accusing us both, Miss Marple? I am suggesting, Miss Marple said, that one of you has carried the weight of the other's mistake for quite long enough, and that in doing so, she has made a mistake of her own. Walsh's gaze shifted between them. We'll need the truth before this is done, and I'd prefer it from your own lips rather than the coroner's verdict. The silence stretched. The only sound was the faint tick of the mantel clock, steady as a heartbeat. Margaret's eyes met Eleanor's, and in that long glance was something like a conversation. Questions, refusals, perhaps even bargains, passed without a word. Lady Florence broke it. If either of you has anything to say, you had best say it now. But neither spoke. Not yet. Walsh closed his notebook. Then we'll adjourn until this afternoon, but I'll warn you, by then I'll have enough from the evidence to put someone in the dock. He left with Benson at his heels. The others drifted out in 2s and 3s, murmuring in low voices. Only Miss Marple lingered, watching the sisters as they rose. Margaret touched Eleanor's arm, a small, almost tender gesture. Eleanor flinched. When they had gone, Miss Marple looked out at the rain-streaked lawn. The pieces were nearly all in place. By evening, she thought, the net would close, not just on the murderer, but on the arrangement between the twins that had been their strength and their undoing. Chapter 8. Truth Unmasked. By late afternoon, the rain had cleared, leaving the lawns washed and shining under a cold, hard sun. Greystoke Hall seemed almost too still, the kind of stillness that follows a decision not yet spoken aloud. At 5:30, Inspector Walsh summoned everyone once more to the drawing room. The lamps were lit early, casting long shadows over the carpet. The fire burned bright, but offered little comfort. Lady Florence sat in her accustomed place, her embroidery basket beside her. Mr. Bletchley, solemn as the parish memorial, stood near the mantel. Dr. Lytton had a chair by the window, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Benson and Mrs. Lane kept discreet watch by the door. And in the centre of the room, side by side as always, sat the Miss Greys, Eleanor in her sober navy, Margaret in soft green. Walsh stood near the hearth, notebook in hand. I've spent the day piecing together movements, witnesses, and what we've learned about that business in Egypt. But I'll admit, he glanced at Miss Marple, there's one person here who sees the threads better than I do. Miss Marple, who had been knitting something small and white with her usual calm, set the needles aside. I'll do my best, she said, though the truth is rarely complicated. People's reasons are complicated. The acts themselves are often quite simple. She looked at the sisters. 2 years ago, in Mardi, a Mr. Arnold Tripp died suddenly after dinner. The only people in the house, besides his wife and a servant, were a nurse companion, Miss E. Grey, and a lady guest, dark-haired and lively, as the papers said. There was talk of poison, but no proof. Shortly afterwards, Miss E. Grey returned to England with a reference, and her lively companion remained abroad a while. Margaret tilted her head, a faint smile playing at her lips. Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on the carpet. When one twin came to work here as governess, Miss Marple went on, the other still lived abroad. Then some months ago they began to exchange places for days at a time, perhaps weeks, using their likeness to cover for each other. Why? Because the name E. Grey was in danger of being linked with the death in Egypt, a change of setting, a change of role, and the story would fade. Margaret laughed softly. A romantic idea, but can you prove it? I don't need to prove the exchanges. Ida saw you, or your sister, in 2 different dresses within an hour, and the housekeeper heard voices in the East Wing discussing not keeping it up much longer. What matters is that Colonel Beverley had learned the truth. His briefcase contained letters from a solicitor about the Grey case, the very words in the London newspaper notice. He intended to confront one of you. His note in the case says, "Arrange meeting with M. Urgent. Matter of identity." She paused, letting the weight of the words settle. That meeting took place on the morning of his death. 2 glasses of whiskey were poured, one for the Colonel, one for the visitor. Digitalis tincture, bought from Harper & Sons in Mardi, was added to his glass. Only one person in this house had a reason to use that particular chemist. Her eyes rested on Margaret. You, Miss Margaret. You were the lively guest in Mardi, and you purchased the Digitalis for a heart patient, a story your sister Eleanor believed. But Mr. Tripp died, and Eleanor realized too late what you had done. To protect you, she let you take her place in England at times while she stayed away. That arrangement worked until the Colonel saw you here and recognized you from Mardi. Margaret's smile had vanished, replaced by a stillness that was almost more dangerous. You've no proof beyond gossip and guesswork. There is more, Miss Marple said. The glove smudge on the east corridor windowsill, chalk from the latch, matched the residue on your glove the morning after the murder. You used that window to avoid the main hall after leaving the library. The scent of your perfume was in the library that morning, though Eleanor is known to dislike it, and the bottle of Digitalis tincture was found in the East Wing bathroom waste bin, where only you had reason to be, since your room is there. Eleanor gave a small, strangled sound. I told you to get rid of it, she whispered. Margaret turned to her sister. And what was I to do? Let him ruin us both? Walsh stepped forward. Is that an admission, Miss Margaret? Margaret's gaze moved between Walsh and Eleanor. Call it what you like. I won't have Eleanor dragged through the mud for this. The Colonel would have destroyed her as surely as me. I did what was necessary. Eleanor's face was ashen. And I've been lying to keep you safe ever since. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Safety built on a lie is only a reprieve, and you've been reprieving each other for a long time. Walsh closed his notebook with a quiet snap. Margaret Grey, I'll need you to come with me. She rose, smoothing her skirt with deliberate calm. I suppose I always knew it would end in a drawing room, she said. At least I had some good years. Eleanor sat rigid, hands clenched in her lap. As the door closed behind her sister, she let out a long breath, the kind that comes when a weight has been lifted, or when the last chance to carry it has gone. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. Twins, she said softly, are a little like 2 mirrors facing each other. They can make the same picture forever, but sooner or later a crack shows in one, and then it's in both. Lady Florence, after a long silence, said, Will she hang? That will be for the courts to decide, Miss Marple replied, but whatever the sentence, the truth will have stopped its running. Outside, the cold sun was sinking behind the trees, and the long shadows of Greystoke Hall stretched across the wet lawns like fingers reaching for the dark.